So then we might be double recordings.
Oh, we'll
Just,
figure it out.
yeah, we'll figure it out.
It went away, so I don't know if it's still live or not, because it said you're live, and I tried to click on it just to check, and it says,
Okay, now it's saying that we're live.
okay.
Yeah, now we're here. Yay. James Moffett, welcome. Thank
Hey,
you
I'm excited.
so much.
Thank you for having me. I feel honored to be a guest with you.
Are you kidding me? I'm
I'm so
honored to have you
serious.
as my guest.
You're the
Like,
big deal. I was just talking to a teacher not that long ago. I said I need to get out the phone because I'm about to get on a call with you. And I said your name, and she said, I know that name. Where do I know that name from? And then I said, hear this now, and she's like, oh my God, I know that name. So say you're
oh
it's a big
my
deal.
God, well, I'm working at it. So welcome. Thank you. I'm glad you're here with us and or here with me.
Yeah.
And I want to talk tonight a bit about we're going to start with how you and I got to know each other. Do you
Okay.
remember this? I do this with every one of my guests. Do you remember?
I'm sure. I'm guessing it's somehow through Jim. That's my guess, but I'm not. I don't remember. It's been a while now.
Well, I'm going to remind you because
Okay.
then you're going to remember, and then you're going to remember why you don't remember. So you and I met officially for the first time 2 years ago at the Attachment and Trauma Network
DC.
conference in DC.
Yes. Okay.
And it was a group of us that got together for some beverages. Sort of at the end of the day, I think you had presented that day. I was exhibiting at the conference at the time. And it was Jim. So Jim Spore Leader was our mutual contact that brought us together. And we had some really good dialogue with, do you remember, like Brittany Ray and
It was a good time.
Ashley
Yeah.
and Maggie and like all these folks from Tree up in Maine. And that was when I first got a sense of who you were. And I was immediately like, I got it. I was like, oh yeah, James Moffett, he's got that magnetic thing going on. People want to hear him talk.
When we think about this last year, and we mentioned it a little bit, I think that's the one thing that I miss more than anything is like when you go to those conferences like that, and just the, being in a space with so many other like-minded people, and just being able to dialogue and have conversation is just, I feel like I grow so much from that. And then your PLN grows when you get back and you're following these people on Twitter and you're following people on Facebook, and you begin to see who they are and what they stand for and read their work. And I think it's one thing to see somebody on Twitter and follow them like heartedly, but it's one thing to meet them and feel that, that magnetism you're talking about, and feel that, and then follow them and then connect with them. That's a whole different experience. So I have missed that this year for sure.
Yeah, no, and yeah, we can talk about that a bit in a little bit too, just to sort of the loss of that and what that's meant for the movement and what that's meant, for those of us that I think this is really our calling. I like that. This is our soul work. That's somebody at some point along the way was put those terms on it. This is really your purpose, and it's your soul work. And so when you meet other people that it's that for them as well, it's just so incredibly powerful. So I met you there and started, I think we started corresponding back and forth about things. And then of course you had already known Laura Keene and stuff. And then fast forward, and you were supposed to come and present in Portsmouth, New Hampshire last year for our second annual Trauma Responsive Schools Conference pre-COVID, and that all got canceled, of course. But we did our live conference or our virtual conference. It was you and me and Laura and a couple other folks who joined in, and that was such an awesome experience virtually.
That was probably the closest thing to that connection you feel being in person.
Yeah.
It's that group, and I can't remember exactly, maybe 200 people, if that. And it was just the energy that you could feel. And I really enjoyed the way that, obviously we prepared for that, and you and Laura and I talked about that a lot, but like the way that it just kind of flowed, and the way that, our different experiences led to some really good conversation, and it kind of flowed between the three of us and what we had to share and what we had to receive. And the energy of those participants as well was pretty special.
It was pretty profound. It was awesome, which is why we're super psyched to have you again present for our third annual conference this year, which will look a little different than last year in terms of just more presenters and stuff. But So before we get into any of that, though, I think that our audience may want to learn a little bit more about who you are. At least I'm that person that I always want to sort of understand or contextualize what brings someone into a certain kind of work, or why are they so driven to do things in the way that they do them. And so, I've heard you speak over time about sort of how you were raised,
Mhm.
and because I know that you have good parents,
Yep,
and
yep.
they've been huge in forming who you are, but they were strict,
They were
right?
very strict. I'm still scared of my parents. So yeah. But
Yeah, they were kind
I
of like,
but
they're
it's
like,
funny because even when I think back on that, I think, one of my biggest pet peeves as we do this work and the things that we hear is that whole, and I had a quote about this a couple of years ago that people really liked. And I said, I am a trauma informed educator, but I'm not a pushover. Right.
mm-hmm,
And I think when we
mm-hmm.
get into this work, I think some people lean so far that way of, we'll talk about this more, I'm sure, but you get this overly empathetic, it's almost this like, this pity that you feel for some of your students who come from just traumatic experiences. And that's not where we want to be. But I think about my own parents, and they were strict, but like, even in the way that they raised me, there was definitely a relationship piece that when I look back now, there was always the conversation as to why they felt the way they felt, why they behaved the way they behaved, what their intent was, and that it was always from a place of care and love.
Right,
And so
right.
even when I didn't understand it, even in my frustration, like when I was able to regulate myself and I didn't know what I was doing then, I always felt safe. And I think a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the way I was raised, even though it's in contrast to some of what I do now, I think it's helped shape who I am now for sure. And it shapes, how I interact with kids or how I interact with staff on a daily basis. So, just
And
to
I think what I hear, yeah, and I think I hear what I hear you describing is that you're really clear about how to set boundaries
yeah,
so that there is a container that does actually can create a lot of safety, just sort of being clear on those expectations, and that, being empathic and being compassionate doesn't mean that just anything flies and
yeah,
anything can
yeah,
go. We need like that, there needs to be that beautiful dance
yeah.
between some limitations, some expectations, coupled with some grace, right?
Yep. And I think, even the staff that I work with now, like expectations is the word they hear from me a lot.
Mm,
I think that comes from just studying the work and knowing that when we see behaviors, it always comes back to expectations. And we know it
mm,
comes down to two things. It comes down to either the expectation hasn't been made clear, or
mhm,
a student or a staff member didn't have the skill to meet the expectation. So either
mhm,
way, it comes back to expectation. So we had a PD day on Friday, and Friday morning, we spent probably an hour talking about expectations and setting that, but also after setting the expectation, having conversations about accountability, structure, and consequences. And it was
mm,
really, I mean, calculated, but just deliberate conversation where people felt heard and people felt valued. But like we had to
mm.
really break down that barrier of like, those aren't, negative words. And I think sometimes as we move into this trauma informed work, like we try to disassociate ourselves with those words because we view those in a very negative light. But I
Yeah.
think, the more that we focus on relationships and care and concern, the more that those words, expectations, accountability, structure, and consequences, we can view those from a positive space of what kids need and what kids look forward to, and how kids can really, again, like I felt, feel safe and supported. So that was a really good conversation for us on Friday.
So talk a bit about, like, did you have, I mean, I sort of feel like I've heard you say this in the past, but you did have an aha moment. There was a shift for you
Yeah.
from, yeah, from and I know it came through Jim. So, and you maybe have shared the story in other places, but share it again for our audience currently. Like, so because you were raised in
Yeah.
more of maybe like some rigid expectations, that might have been your orientation, because you were a kindergarten teacher initially, weren't
I
you?
started that way. I think, for me, school was, as a student, school was really easy for me. Like I mean,
Mm,
I got really good grades. I mean, I got into minimal trouble. I got into kid trouble, but nothing serious. But school was always really easy for me. And I knew I was that person who in the third grade, I knew what I wanted to do in life. I knew very early I wanted to be a teacher, I wanted to be a principal, and I wanted to be a superintendent.
No way, seriously?
I knew in the third grade. And as I got
Wow,
older,
that's incredible.
I know, as I got older, I kind of mapped that out. And I always said it's going to be like a 10-10-10 plan, 10 years as a teacher, 10 years as a principal, and 10 years as a superintendent. And then we'll see after that. And
Listen to
so
you, my
I knew this.
God.
Yeah, I knew this before I graduated high school. I knew this,
Wow.
the plan at least. And so I did teach for 10 years. And it's kind of funny. Like one of the things that happened to me is I interviewed for a principal position after my 9th year of teaching. And I walked out of there like confident that I had a job, just confident. And they called me and told me they offered a job to somebody else. And I remember being so frustrated. And then I sat there and I'm thinking, I said, I kind of spoke this into my own existence. I told myself it was always going to be 10 years, 10 years, 10 years. And it was crazy because then the very next year, the same position that I was, somebody else took from me the year before, that person already left. And I got a job. I got the exact same job that I'd interviewed for the year before, but it felt right because it was after 10 years, and so
Wow.
now I'm in that year 6 of this second 10 years, and we'll see how it plays out because I love what I do right now. But I think because school was so easy for me, one of the things I struggled with sometimes as a teacher and as in my first year in admin was, how do I connect to kids that school's not easy for?
Mm.
And then
Mm.
as a student, like I had parents who were rigid in what they expected and very clear in their expectations. And one of the things I share all the time was one of the reasons I feel I was set up for success is because the expectations my parents had for me at home were the same as the expectations my students, teachers, my principals had for me at school. So it was really easy for me to transition back and forth. But as a teacher and a principal, what about those kids where that transition wasn't easy? What about
Yes.
the kids where, the expectations or what was allowed at home was starkly different than what was expected at school. And so for years as a teacher and that first year as a principal, like I felt like I was searching for something and I was onto it. I knew relationships were important. I knew that. And I knew that I had a really good ability to connect with anybody from any background, but connecting with them was the first step. But sometimes I struggle with that second step is I'm connected with them. How do I have an impact? And how do I, there's that struggle between sympathy and empathy. Like, how do I make myself empathetic to what they're dealing with when I've never dealt with that? And so it was my first year as a principal after teaching for 10 years. And I taught kindergarten for 2 years and I taught first grade for 2 years and I taught fifth grade for 6 years. And so in that transition to teaching or to a principal, I was very authoritative because that's what I knew. That was what I knew. That's what I knew as a child. That's what I knew as a student at school. And so one of the things we often think about is, we parent like we were parented, we teach like we were taught, but you're also, you administer the way you were administered to as a student. And that was always very fear-based, very, this is the expectation, you don't do it. It was very black and white. And when I think back now and I think about that black and white, that goes against everything that I feel now as a trauma-informed teacher, administrator. Like, I feel like, there's some teachers that are very black and white, but when it comes to being trauma-informed or trauma responsive or just, responsive to kids' needs, it's about living in the gray all the time. It's like you make your home in the gray because it's really taking into account every detail that you know about a student and the relationship that you have, where they come from, what they're experiencing, and you're trying to make sure that you give off what they need. It's just like teaching, like in teaching, like it's about me finding out where a kid is and helping them grow and helping them move. It's the same way when it comes to that social, emotional, behavioral discipline piece. And so I did go to this conference and it was a Safe and Secure Schools conference. And if I'm being completely honest, I share this story all the time. It was my first year as a principal. It was my very first conference. I was excited just to not be at school for a day. And I had heard fun things about conferences and principals hanging out. So I was excited about that. But I did.
Like, how old are you at that point too, James? Like
I was 30 years old. I was 30. And I think,
my God, you're on the complete fast track here.
Yeah. And so I think the part that was hard was, I was 30 years old going into a building. And not only that, I was 30 years old going into a building that was very traditional, very traditional. And it was successful based on the type of student that they had. And, as a 30-year-old, going in and trying to change initiatives and try to be innovative, like you're looked
You
at.
are a baby.
Yeah, yeah. And so to be
Oh my.
studied, to have teachers in the building who have been not only teaching in that building, but teaching in the same classroom, in the same grade longer than I've been alive, that was that in itself was a learning curve. And
Yeah.
so fast forward to this conference, and I stumble into this screening of Paper Tigers. I had never heard anything about it. I had never heard the name Jim Sporleader. But instantly in those first couple minutes, I was just taken aback and I was just engaged in what I was watching as we watched the screening of this movie. And then afterwards, we got to hear Jim speak, and he answered some questions. But I realized in that moment that was the missing piece. Like as he got into the brain science and he got into the importance of relationships, I think for all of us, behaviorism is very real. And when we're in school, that's what we're taught. That's what we're, as students,
Amen.
what we experience. When we go to college, that's what we're taught. And so you carry that into your classrooms, you carry that into your buildings. And so to hear somebody say that behavior is not always a choice, that's like a slap in the face. Like, no, like it is a choice. That's what I've always been taught. That's what everybody's, they've told me behavior is a choice. That kid's choosing to be manipulative. That kid's choosing, all these things. That's attention seeking. That's what you've been taught. And so to really reflect and think about something different. And what I appreciate is, because I knew I was looking for a missing piece, I was able to really accept somebody tell me that what I had always been taught might not be accurate.
Yeah.
So
you felt that inner dissonance, like you felt that like what I've been taught doesn't really feel right in my body in terms of what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing.
And because I had felt this pull for a while, especially the last 4 or 5 years as a teacher, like what I've been taught, but what my heart feels as I'm connecting with a kid, it doesn't line up to, have this punitive discipline for all these behaviors when I know that's not what that kid needs. And I know that's what my heart, not what my heart or their heart
wants
needs
to do.
Exactly. And so I watched this screening and I go back to my room that night and I'm just like, wow. And there was another principal with me and she got it too. And we actually sent Jim a message on Twitter that night.
Using the social media. I love it.
Right. And so like not even expecting a reply, because by this point in that hour and a half of that movie, he's gone from Jim Sporley to this name I've never heard to this celebrity status, right?
All right.
So I send this message and basically I pour my heart out and say, hey, I'm a first year principal. Like I can admit that I don't have all the answers for sure. And what you're saying makes sense to me. Like I need to see the practicality of that. What does that look like? And so the next morning we wake up and he had actually messaged us back, and which was like, oh my God. And like, he didn't just message us back. He gave us his phone number and said, give me a call. And so we were able to begin corresponding with him, and he walked both of us through in our buildings, like really what that journey looked like. And he suggested things for us to do with staff. And he shared, he was in the middle of writing a book at that time. And before that book even came out, he allowed us access to a lot of the materials in that book. And so we were one of the first, this is way back 2015, I think 2015, 16. We were one of the first staffs to really dive into Help for Billy and read that and really understand that. We were one of those first staffs to really get into fostering resilient learners and, really read those things and really begin to understand those things. And I'll be honest, at that time, 2015, that's a time frame where there's not, PD that you can just call somebody to come in and talk about common form work. So it was really a risk that we were willing to take. And one thing I am a risk taker. And so I saw the value in the work. So I was willing to take a risk, even though I didn't know where we were headed yet. I was willing to jump on board because I knew what we were doing, what I was doing right then wasn't what was best for kids. So I was willing to take a risk and try something until we found what was best for kids. And so
how was that? So I'm curious, just like, we've talked about this, of course, but I'm curious too, what did you experience with your staff when you did come back and you did return, because I think this is an important piece of all of this work, right? Is that there are those of us who might have this kind of sort of aha moment, like this major paradigm shift that happens sort of almost instantaneously, where everything suddenly makes sense. And then you're charged with this like inner burning need to like make things different. Because you recognize like we are causing harm to keep doing the way, doing things the way we've been doing them, right? And So you like return to your school, and what did you experience with your staff? Because what you might have experienced, like most places, is that not everybody else is feeling your vibe necessarily.
So here's the wisdom I got from my superintendent at that time, who is an amazing, amazing man. He shared with me, you'll never be an expert unless you're 50 miles from home. And at the time,
Amen.
yeah,
I can salute to that.
right. And so at the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. And I can tell you now, I've begun this work twice now. So I did it that first time in that building, and now I'm doing the work again. This is my first year in a different building. And I can tell you my approach this time is very different than my approach the first time. And I think the difference for me when I think about this was, you know, I was trying to get a staff that first time to do trauma-informed work, but I was expecting it in a very authoritative way.
Mm-hmm.
Because like you said, I was so excited. It made perfect sense to me. And so the frustration of why doesn't this make perfect sense to you? It should. And I was very authoritative, and we will do this, we will do this, we will do this. And they're very demanding. And the thing was, there was lots of staff, and you have staff that you're pulling along. And let's be clear, there's a time sometimes to bring and pull some staff along sometimes, but if you're pulling the majority of your staff along, that's not the right thing to be doing or the right time, right?
Right.
And so over those 5 years that I was there, I would say by the end, most of us were there. Most of us finally had the light bulb turn on and say, you know, what we've been doing traditionally isn't what's best for kids. I think the difference this time is, you know, teachers are very calculated. Teachers are very analytical. Teachers can be very black and white.
Amen.
And I know what I know about me is I'm very big picture. I'm very extremely big picture. And so now part of the journey is getting the right people around me that understand that I'm big picture, and that when I throw a big idea out there, they know how to figure out all the steps that are going to get us there. Yeah. Because and that's an important piece, because I am so big picture.
It's a huge piece, and you're also inadvertently engaging them in the work and empowering them, because you're equipping them to do what they do best, which is sort of figure out, okay, well, what's the sequence of how this should look, and what are the things that we need to do to bring this about, you know? And so it's not just James's work, it's now your work as a group, your work as a school.
And I think now, and I think this last year is, you know, what a year to start a new building, right? Like in the middle of the pandemic. But I think
okay, so hold on. Okay, so before you go into that,
yeah,
because we talked a few times earlier in the year, like, what was that like for you to? I mean, I just like mind blown just imagining you, because you knew you were coming into this new position.
Yeah.
Like in the spring of last.
Well, I mean, it's crazy. Right? I got hired on February 24th.
Okay, there you go.
And then that's
2 weeks before lockdown.
And then 2 weeks later, we shut down.
Right.
And so to go from, you know, beginning to make plans of how can I connect with these people, because I am so social and so relationship centered. Like, what's the best way for me to connect with these people and, you know, begin to know them by name and know their family and, you know, just love on them and let them know that they're valued and appreciated and that I see them. And then to be shut down where I can't do those things. It was a difficult task, but I do think it was a godsend the way that it happened, because I think it really allowed me to see the importance of trauma-informed work for staff as well.
Amen, brother. Amen, brother.
When I go back to that first experience where it was like very authoritative, doing things to staff to get them to do things for kids. Mm-hmm. And think about that. I was doing things to staff, expecting them to do things for kids. And now this experience, it's like, how can I do for staff, with staff, alongside staff, to get them to understand the importance so that they can do those same things for their kids?
Amen.
And I think, unfortunately, it did take a pandemic, and not just for me, I think for all of us, that pandemic did some things. It really did have this sense of forced empathy, this sense of forced mutual understanding, this sense of really understanding the importance of relationship and social emotional learning and all those pieces. It forced all those things on us that I think we were headed that way anyway, because we talk in Kansas so much about the power of redesign, and we were redesigning all these schools. But this really accelerated that and made that happen so much quicker, because the reality is schools should have been redesigned years ago. And we knew that. We knew that. We
Yes.
just weren't willing to take a risk and just do it. And this forced us just to do it. And it was a good thing, even in the midst of the chaos and even in the midst of the overwhelm and the burnout that we feel. It's been, I think, when the dust settles, whenever that is, I think we're going to look back on this and find ourselves in a much better place than we were when we went into it.
And you know, it's funny because we've talked about this a bit, just that you are in the fortunate context of being in Kansas, where you guys have a really kick-ass, pioneer as an educational commissioner, right?
Yep.
That is spearheading, I think, groundbreaking work in terms of this whole redesign initiative, but also just, some of the things that you've described to me about, what Kansas puts on paper about, sort of, like, I guess in some ways it speaks to what you're describing in terms of sharing power.
Yeah.
It's not this top-down governmental, like, we're going to tell you how to do education. It's like, we're going to give you like a seat at the table, and we acknowledge that what we're doing currently hasn't really served us all that well. So let's be more innovative. Let's be more oriented towards the relational. Let's, you know what I mean? Like, let's look at the science. And I mean, is that accurate in terms of?
I think, what we've done or what we're doing as the state is what we should be doing in education anyway. We talk so much about personalized learning, but at the same time, we've never allowed schools to personalize what they do.
Exactly.
And I think what they have done, it's not top down. What they've said is we need to redesign. And then they've allowed us to really look at the staff that we have, look at the clientele that we have, and decide what does the redesign look like for our building. And I appreciate that it's not even your district. It's like, what does redesign look like for your specific building?
Exactly.
And I know Dr. Watson, one of the things he talks about as the commissioner of education was he's the first, leader on a level like that I've heard use words like trauma-informed care or words like social emotional learning, or to say that, when I list out the goals of our state when it comes to education, that SEL, that trauma-informed care, is higher on my agenda than academics. Like,
oh my gosh, like,
so
seriously?
for me. Yeah, so that's so unusual for me because, like, and especially, and I like how all these stars are aligning for me, because that year when I was off doing consulting work, and even before that when I was consulting, going to all these states and traveling and hearing where they are in comparison to where we are. So to go to Florida and have these conversations with principals about retention in third grade for students who don't pass the state assessment, or to go to other states where they talk about, academics, and for me to have the leeway or the ability to look at a schedule and prioritize what's important and say, we're starting every classroom every single day with a social emotional block because it's that important. But not only that, it can't just stay in isolation there. Like, it has to be, continued throughout the entire day. And that when I look at our schedule, every class right after lunch, we have a block for another SEL block or mindfulness or something like that. Like, those are pieces that allow us to do the things that we're doing. Yeah. And then to go to other places like in North Carolina and New York and have conversations with administrators and districts and say, let's look at your schedule. Let's see how we can make this work for you. And to hear that they don't have the freedom to do that made me appreciate what we're doing here even more.
So talk a little bit about that. I know we've already been talking. We could just talk about like 1,000 things, James. I'll try to contain myself, but talk a little bit about that. Like, you had, and this is it's become like a fast trigger for me, this whole learning loss hype, frankly, bullshit that is being proliferated everywhere. And I think that doesn't just come from government, that's also coming from, frankly, financial interests in keeping the system as it currently exists, right? So people don't acknowledge or aren't aware. Jim Sporleader and I have had this conversation many times about the incredible business that is behind assessment and curriculum and all of that. And so there's a lot of reasons why people want it to stay as it is. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I'm curious about is just, how do you experience that currently in your school, in terms of, do you feel that pressure from your families about those concerns that are genuine? And also, how do you feel about, like, we just we just elected a president whose wife is an educator, and then the Biden administration goes ahead and reinstates all the standardized testing mandates in every state. Like, did that like blow your mind like it blew my mind? Like, so where are you in all this learning loss frenzy or panic?
Well, I agree with you on that. I don't believe in learning loss. And actually, Matthew Portell was the first person. I saw a statement that he put out there, and he said learning loss was bullshit, is basically what he said, right?
Amen.
I'll say the first time I read it, I was kind of like, huh, I'm not sure where I stand on that. Let me reflect on that. Let me think on that. And I began to think on it more, and I commented on something that you put out there because I have accepted, I do believe that learning loss does not exist. I think when we talk about the loss that's occurred through this pandemic, I feel like the real loss is in relationship. The real loss has been in connection. And I think what that does is that does manifest itself in some way, that there's a connection, a correlation between relationships and academics, and we know that. And so I think there is some correlation there, but I'm more concerned about the loss of connection, the loss of relationship.
Exactly.
In this past year, I kind of put together, I guess it's been over 2 years now, these trauma-informed mindsets. And these are the things that, like, if you're truly moving in a trauma-informed direction, these are the things that I feel like your organization has to encompass and really believe and really set as a priority. And one of them, if I'm remembering, it's number 7, and it talks about, academic achievement doesn't happen just with more homework and more rigor and more assignments. That's not how academic achievement happens. That's not how academic growth happens. I feel like the only way to see academic growth is through improved relationship.
I agree.
So what are we doing throughout our day? And one of the presentations I've done a couple times at conferences is how do we shift from being, content focused schools, just rules and consequences focused schools? How do we shift towards being a relationship focused school? Because when I prioritize relationships in everything that I do, from the way we come into our building, to what our lunch period looks like, to the interactions that happen across grade levels, both horizontally and vertically, that's when we begin to see true change in the culture of a building. When I begin to prioritize, how we treat one another, and I begin to prioritize, we call them the Power 12. These are those 12 guiding principles that we look for and expect students to, show responsibility and have initiative, and have, to be able to contemplate and show courage. Those are the things that are more important. And one of the activities I would always do as I went out and presented was I'd ask, thousands of educators in a room to tell me, in one word, how would you characterize a successful adult? And I give them some time to think about it. And I usually hear from every person in the room. I don't care how long it takes, because the point that I always try to get across is all the thousands of responses I've heard, I've never heard somebody say intelligence. That's not how we characterize a successful adult. I've never heard somebody say how many words I can read per minute or how many math facts I know. That's never been what I've heard. I've always heard those soft skills, those essential skills, like that compassion, that contemplation, initiative, courage. Those are the words that I hear. And so then I always tie it back to, like, I'm a mission statement guy. I love mission statements. Any school that I go into, most businesses, I want to read their mission statement, because I do feel that it's not just words on paper. It should really drive everything that we do. And when I look at most schools' mission statements, they always talk about making kids successful adults. Like, when they leave our doors, this K-12 system, when they leave, we want to help them be successful adults. Well, what does that mean? We say that as educators, even we say it's these essential skills, but we don't focus enough on those things. We focus so much on the academic part. So we're doing kids a disservice. We're not doing our job if all we're focusing on is the academic piece and never focusing on those essential skills. So it's about balancing those things. And how do I spend more time on that? Because that's more important to me, especially knowing that it's eventually going to correlate to those academic skills.
I mean, you're singing my tune. Like, I don't even, this is why it's like, we can just, we don't even have to talk about these things, because it is.
What's exciting is I'm singing your tune, and that's exciting. But I think as we go through this pandemic, I'm singing more people's tunes. They're beginning to get it. And so I think the hard part is, and we've said this before too, how do we maintain this momentum? Like, I don't want us to get to a point, oh, COVID's over, like we're done, like we're going to go back to business as usual. We're back in brick and mortar doing school the way we've always done it. I don't want to get back to that. That's the part that makes me nervous.
And I would agree with that. And I think that that's part of why I find myself really kind of with Hear This Now, really trying to push um, push the boundary even more, be more direct with, as I have districts reaching out to me looking for training. I know you've experienced this too as a consultant, James, but a lot of times people get in education, districts get excited about what's the latest, what's the greatest, what's the trend.
Yeah.
And I'm finding that I'm being much more deliberate about the conversations of like, this isn't like just like a fad. This isn't just like a little one-off or a little add-on or a little, we're going to just sprinkle in a little trauma informed. This is a true cultural shift. And it's incumbent upon us to bring it about, not only because we know it's what serves children well, and actually it serves the adults well too, but it's also because we are really hurting as a country and as a people in this country. So many of the things that we have experienced this year, whether it's the, racial injustice crisis that is just so obvious and in our face, or the, economics, the disparities in the economics, or it's the political divide, all these things, in my opinion, they really kind of, obviously there are traumas, there's a lot of traumas that are unhealed, but they also take root in our educational system, because that's the one system that we all experience, right? Like not everybody experiences prison, not everybody experiences foster care, not everybody experiences even healthcare, but we do all experience education in some form or fashion. And so I just feel like we cannot ignore that any longer and deny that and think that the answer lies in standardized education with more assessments. We've done that for 20 years and we've spent billions of dollars, and all we've done is make those that are vulnerable and marginalized more traumatized. So I'm just like, I know for me, like with Hear This Now, the work that we're doing, I'm just like not apologetic about that anymore. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm just like, this is the new day. And what is exciting, and this is just in my experience, and James is going to have the opportunity to actually join a cohort that we developed, one of the new programs that Hear This Now developed this year as a pilot, which we will have next year in a bigger form, is we are intentionally coaching trauma-informed female school leaders, because it's been in my experience with Hear This Now that the vast majority of my clients are women. And it's women, and this is what makes you a unique man, but it has been women that have sort of, if you will, gotten this more quickly than men.
Yeah.
And in particular white men. And so so James is going to have an opportunity on Friday to actually join this group of women that we've been coaching and guiding and leading and teaching and training since January. They're super excited to have you with us. But I think that in many ways, it's going to be that it's sort of like, for any of us that maybe have felt in our lived experience that our voice has been unheard, we have to do what we can to counter that inferiority complex or that imposter syndrome, because it's upon us now to make ourselves be heard, to not allow the status quo to get reinstated. That would be a greater injustice than what even was pre-COVID, honestly, So we've talked about this a little bit, and we can sort of end on this note too, but I'm just curious, what have been your reflections this year in reflecting on, I know that your experience as a Black man has, in the context of what's happened in this last year and being an educator, that's caused you to reflect more deeply on your own experiences. And so like, where do you see that intersection in the work now, or how is that intersection deepening for you?
I think, you use the word unapologetic. And I think for a while I was very apologetic about the work that I was doing, especially as a Black man, and always being super cautious about how that was perceived. So I never wanted to, as I focused on social justice, or as I focused on equity or racial equality, as I focused on those things, I never wanted it to be perceived as he's only focusing on that because And so that was a struggle for a while. And now as I look at doing that from an unapologetic stance, it's about this is what's right, this is what's necessary, this is what's needed. And I have to look past being worried about somebody else's perception and really living in the moment and really living in this is a gift I feel like I have. I have a gift that I'm able to share. And part of the gift is just having a platform to share this openly with so many people, whether it be here or social media or other podcasts that I'm on. So every opportunity that I have to talk about equity or racial equality or social justice, like in fact, one of our interview questions, and I think it's one of my favorite interview questions now, when we're interviewing teachers, and we're in the midst of doing that right now, as I say, I'm going to give you 4 terms, and I want you to define these terms and what do they mean to you as an educator. And so those 4 terms are, equity is one of those terms, social justice, social emotional learning, and trauma-informed care. Because I want to feel, what do you feel about those things? I think as a country, we're past the point of equity and social justice and racial equality being, pigeonholed for only Black people or people of color.
Right.
Like, this is something that we all have to really feel, experience, share our perceptions in, our perspectives in. And so I think I am unapologetic. This is how I feel. I feel very strongly about this. And so as I think about, we do a 1 book a month thing where I read to kids every single month, and it's been through Zoom this year. And my goal this year is I wanted every book to have something to do with social justice. I wanted every book to do something with equity, every book. And I think, when you think about kindergarten through 6th grade kids, one of the joys that I have now is walking into a room and hearing the dialogue that they're having. One of the books that we read a couple months ago was Separate is Never Equal. And it talked about Mexican Americans in California. And it was based on a true story, and how this family came and they were trying to have equal rights for the schools that their children went to, and how that was such a struggle for them. And I think, we hear such innocence in the voices of kids when they talk about that's not right, that's not okay. And I asked them to try to, narrate and really depict or illustrate what they saw or what they heard as I read the book. And one of my favorite pictures there's a couple of them that really stood out, but there was one where it was a school that was on one side of the paper. It was downtrodden, it was beaten, it was, paint chipped and bricks missing. And there was another school that was very pristine that they had talked about, how this was the white school and this was the colored school. And as I walked into this classroom of 5th graders, to hear them talk so eloquently and so adamantly about the racism that they saw or the racism that they heard in that, and how that wasn't okay, that's something that, to me, if we don't have those conversations with kids right now, we're going to lose the foothold that we have right now to bring about see change. And so also, like, I can't leave that conversation there. Like, what's the next step? What's the conversation we have now? How do we empower them to advocate for change? How do we empower them that, this is what the world looks like, and it's looked like for a long time, whether it be systematic racism or social injustice? Let's have those conversations.
Amen.
And let's begin to let their voices be heard, because I think the more that we silence them, or the more that we say that this is a topic we can't talk about at school, the more likely they are to follow the footsteps of what's happened before them. And so
Absolutely.
I think we
Absolutely. And I think that that's even as important. Like, so in New Hampshire, this is a very white state, frankly. We have very tiny, I think it's less than 2% of the population is non-white. And so oftentimes here in these rural areas, people think that we don't need to talk about racism, or it doesn't need to be, or we don't need to discuss equity or these matters because they are not relevant. And it's like, yes, they're relevant everywhere. And like you said, I think for me in my evolution of integrating more consciously that piece of the work, that's always been a piece of the work, but I'm trying to make it a more intentional integration. It's recognizing that as a white person, I need to be talking with other white people about these issues and how racism can show up. And it's interesting because I actually think the terminology that I think resonates more strongly for me is dominant white culture or white supremacy culture, whatever you prefer to use, because that I can really see. like that I can really get my hands on, wrap my mind around, and concretely describe it and what the experience of it is, because I'm a part of it. Meaning, like, I've been subjected to it, and I've also reiterated it. And I think that in many ways, all of us have done that because we haven't been willing or known how, or been thought that these conversations about racism weren't appropriate in certain places, or it wasn't politically correct, or it would make people uncomfortable, and da, da, da. So it's like, it's kind of nice to get to this place of feeling like, you know what, I'm going to lean into the discomfort of, we got to talk about this stuff. This stuff affects everyone in this country, period, end of story. I don't care where you live or who you are, or, you know, what your background is. This is impacting all of us. And it's a necessity in trying to actually achieve that ideal of social justice.
And I
In
think
fact, sorry,
you,
go ahead.
I was going to say, hearing you say that, leaning into the discomfort, that really sticks out to me. And I think, back in February, after we had the attacks on the Capitol, we had a PD day the very next day on a Friday. And I'm driving to work, and I had a plan for what we're going to talk about. I knew like what our agenda looked like for the day. And I felt this push like to throw the agenda out and let's just have conversations. And this was the predominantly white staff. I'm the only Black person on the staff. Let's have a conversation about race and politics. And ESDAC, and them, they had put some things out that night about community circles that you can have around the topic. And I can tell you that that was a very vulnerable conversation for me. I think, and one of the things I tried to preface that whole conversation as we got into small circles and we had guiding questions to kind of lead the discussion was what we know. We're here to let people express how they feel. We're not here with the intent to change somebody's mind. And as we talk about race or we talk about politics, I wanted people to begin to understand, even me as a Black male, how some of those things that we talk about, why my experience is shaped the way that it's experienced. And so I had a conversation with 35 white people where I talked about, I shared an example of having a white girlfriend and getting pulled over and how that experience went for me. As I, had been taught, the talk, when you get pulled over, what you do, your hands are at 10 and 2, you're yes, sir, no, sir, looking straight ahead, asking for permission to get my wallet out, asking for permission to get the registration out, and letting people know I'm about to move my hands off the steering wheel, I'm about to do this. And to have her in the passenger seat, just having a conversation, like, how's it going tonight? And just very different than my experience. But I hope in that night in the conversation I was able to have with her afterwards was I wanted to share my experience and why I behaved the way that I did. And I needed her to understand that. Not that I needed her to agree with it, not that I needed her to accept it, but I needed her to understand why my behavior was what it was. And then she had a conversation with me as well, where she told me why her behavior was what it was and what her experience was. And we're able to come to this, this piece or this mutual agreement of, our experiences are different and they shape our behavior. This is why we behave the way we did. And as I shared that with 35 people in a room that had never heard that, they began to understand some of why I might act the way that I act or behave the way that I behave. And so as we went into those small group circles and I was able to kind of pop into all those circles, what I appreciated about the staff that we're working with now, there was no disagreements. There was active listening. There was nobody interrupting somebody when they spoke. And you could see the active listening taking place. And it was probably, there's two PDs that stand out to me as the most impactful I've ever had. One was a poverty simulation, and that right there was number 2. And afterwards, to have a staff say, wow, that was amazing. I enjoyed the conversation. I enjoyed the ability to be heard. And to get emails from teachers. As a principal, you don't get emails from teachers after a PD day talking about what they were doing. Right? And to get emails from them saying, like, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to be heard. I think that as the adults, we experienced that. And so now we were able to go back to our classrooms and hope that our students can experience that as well. And not shy away from the conversation, have the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's funny you mentioned that too about the healing circles. And so folks don't know, there's a group out of Kansas called ESDAC that James and I know core group of those trainers that are there. And they do really wonderful, they do amazing work. And one of the things that they had developed right after the Capitol attack was it was like a healing circle protocol for the classroom and for staff. And what's funny about that is I took it and I actually adapted it a little bit, but I started using it in a bunch of the trainings that I was doing at the time. And I've now just integrated it into the regulated classroom training that I've been doing, because like you mentioned, it's that particular structure allows people to be witnessed, which is what we need so much right now. We need people to be able to share their story and to be heard and to be seen, and not to be necessarily contested or to be challenged or threatened in any way, right? Because like all of us, there's so much universality in this experience of the pandemic. And at the same time, there's been so many of us that have felt so alone in the experience. And so it's like, you need to be with others to kind of like see that and experience that together. And I agree with you. Like every time I do that work with a group, it's really profound. Yeah. And I'm hopeful that, you know, that's the kind of work that coming out of the conference that we're going to have in June, people will take back and do with their staff and do with students in the classroom where appropriate. So, I mean, James, we have been chit-chatting for 50 minutes. Everybody else I only talked to for like 25 or 30, but it's just like, I could just keep going on, but I'm going to do a little plug. I'm going to do a little plug for the conference. So James is going to be with us. He's going to be in our pre-workshop day for school leaders, our first day, June 1st. He's going to be talking about specific touch points within the school day. He kind of mentioned that there about that can help students and staff experience felt safety in the school environment. So very tangible, concrete kind of things that they do at his school that help to foster that sense of community, but more importantly, that sense of safety and connection with one another. And so we're super psyched to have you with us. I think we'll make it a good time like we always do. And I really appreciate this opportunity to chat with you tonight. So thank you.
Yeah, it just tells me we need to chat more often because we got too much to talk about. So
yeah, I know we do.
Like I said, I feel honored to be on with you today.
Well, thank you. And we'll talk again soon. Take good care and have a good night.
All right, thanks. You too.
See ya.